Dr. Leal and the other two doctors that are inside Ford's theater at the time, they realize that Lincoln's wound is mortal. In fact, they only give Abraham Lincoln approximately about 40 minutes left to live. They want to remove him from the theater. They bring him outside onto the street, and he ends up bringing in here. They order the soldiers to start kicking off the footboard.
You said there were 14 doctors that passed through this room throughout the night.
All the blood that was pouring out is building up inside of Lincoln's cranial cavity. So at this point, they're just trying to do anything they can to prolong his life. One of the procedures that they do about 7 times throughout the night is physically remove that blood clot, either with fingers and then later on with instruments.
Wow.
This is the bullet. This is the ball that killed Abraham Lincoln.
Hey everybody, Dana Shove, Director of Interpretation for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I'm back here with Garrett Cost, Interpretive Ranger at Ford's Theater, and we are in the room in the Petersen house where Abraham Lincoln passed away. His bed is just to my left here, or a replica of the bed is just to my left. It's a very compelling place. And Garrett has done some really interesting research about the first doctor that will attend to Lincoln, and that is this fella here, Charles Leal. And Charles was a United States Army surgeon, and he was at the Armory Square Hospital, which is where the Air and Space Museum is today, roughly speaking. The armory was built in the 1850s. It was a huge armory for D.C. soldiers. They used that as a ward, and they built a whole bunch of wards out behind it. And Leal is in charge of one of those wards. And that's also the hospital Walt Whitman did a lot of his volunteering nursing at. We just put up a small exhibit in our lobby about a soldier, Darius Lilly, who was at Armory Square, and his relationship with Walt Whitman. If you get a chance, come up to the museum and check it out. Now, this guy's 23 years old. He's a kid.
Yeah, by all intents and purposes.
How old are you?
So I am 24 for scale.
24.
So yes.
So 24 for scale. So he is your age essentially, and he is the first to reach Lincoln after he's mortally wounded in the box.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about. You had mentioned he heard Lincoln speak and was captivated. Tell us about his backstory a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah. So Dr. Charles Leal, he came from a medicine background. His father, so he was born and raised in New York City, in downtown Manhattan. His father was actually one of the health commissioners for the city in the 1840s. So Leal, from a very early age, knew he wanted to go into medicine, knew he wanted to study medicine. And so he jumped in almost right away. He would attend Bellevue Medical College, which would then become New York University Medical School today, and he studied under a Dr. Flint and Dr. Hamilton, studied and specialized in diseases of the heart and lungs, as well as gunshot wounds. Now, this is very apt because he would continue his studies during the 1860s, during the American Civil War. So think about, right, especially in the Civil War Medicine Museum, every single new methodology, every new piece of instruments that is coming out, he is learning, and he is learning how to use properly. In 1864, he ends up turning into a medical cadet, right? So this is his practical exercise, so to say. He would go to Elmira prisoner of war camp there in New York, right? Where he would actually end up working very hard to stop an outbreak of cholera there. So he is going to get some real world experience, and then finally graduate, get this, in February of 1865, so about 6 weeks before the assassination.
Wow.
So he is relatively new.
Freshly minted surgeon.
Freshly minted.
Doctor. Yeah.
But he does come down here to D.C., and he is put in charge of an NCO ward at the Armory Square. And it's on the afternoon of April 11th, 1865, so 3 days before the assassination, that he's walking past the White House. Here's Lincoln's last public address. He's never before heard Lincoln speak in his life. And he writes in his diary later, he said that Lincoln had a divine light coming out from behind him, and that he was
really impressed with him.
He was impressed. He said he was entranced. He wanted to see him again as soon as possible. Lo and behold, purchasing a ticket on the night of April 14th at Ford's Theater.
Because he'd heard, did he know that Lincoln was going to attend? He'd heard that?
He did. It was very, very well announced, especially in the evening. Yeah.
Okay, so he's like, I want to be there when he's there. Okay.
Absolutely.
So he ends up going in. I think I read he was not really happy where his seat was located.
Correct, yeah.
But he's in the theater, and this 23-year-old hears the gunshot, and instant confusion breaks out. Booth leaps from the box, the viewing box Lincoln is in, onto the stage. And what does Leal do?
So Leal reacts almost immediately. Keep in mind that Lincoln was indeed shot, but Major Rathbone was slashed as well.
Right.
So as Major Rathbone is holding his bloodied arm, he's calling out for a doctor and yelling to stop that man, right? So Leal ends up getting up, realizes he can't stop that man, so he runs and does the other thing, calls for a doctor, right? So Leal rushes down to the box, and with the help of Major Rathbone, they end up opening the door that John Wilkes Booth had barred. Leal is now inside the box, and he sees wounded Lincoln. He says that his head is tilted slightly forward, and his breathing is stertorous, right? So it's long, it's laborious, it's very strained breathing. And so from there, Leal assumes, because he sees Booth jump out of the box with the knife and sees the slash on Rathbone's arm.
Right.
He believes that Lincoln is stabbed, right? So he lays him down on the floor, starts to look around for a stab wound, doesn't see one. Instead, he realized that Lincoln doesn't have a pulse, right? He says that he holds his right radial pulse, so his right lower arm, in order to find a pulse. He says there's no movement of the artery. So he performs what I'm sure you and some of your other viewers are familiar with, the Hall's Ready resuscitation method, right? The precursor to CPR.
Okay.
So gets that pulse back about 27 beats per minute, but then starts to examine Lincoln's body. Sees that there is no stab wound, instead sees a clot of blood on the lower portion of Lincoln's left shoulder, sees that blood clot, sees his eyes starting to turn ecchymosed, black and blue, and that right eye starting to protrude. He realizes that the only way to help Lincoln in this situation is to get rid of whatever is causing that issue, in this case, a bullet. He takes his right small finger, right pinky finger, a lot of people may find this disgusting today, but inserts it into the bullet wound in order to try and find the bullet. Instead, remembers that blood clot, takes that out instead, and instantly blood, brain matter, pieces of bone, and hair start to ooze, relieving that pressure and actually allowing Lincoln's pulse and his respiration to improve. So it goes up to about 40 some beats per minute.
So he does that, the clot comes out, and it temporarily helps Lincoln. And is it shortly after that they bring him over here?
Yeah, so keep in mind two other doctors that are sat on the first floor of the theater, because Lincoln's box on the second floor, Leal's on the second floor. Two other doctors are hoisted up into the box. These two gentlemen, just to show their faces here, this is Dr. Charles Sabin Taft there, and Dr. Albert A.F. King. These two gentlemen are there inside the theater. They get hoisted up into the box. They agree with all the treatment that Leal has done thus far.
Leal pronounced it mortal pretty quickly.
Yeah. He realizes, again, that there's nothing else left to do. In fact, they only give Abraham Lincoln approximately about 40 minutes left to live. That is their original estimation.
Wow.
But Leal realizes Lincoln is going to die. The other doctors agree. They want to remove him from the theater, make sure he doesn't die in a dirty, dark, disgusting theater.
Right.
They bring him outside onto the street. Again, hear that gentleman, Henry Safford, calling out from the front steps.
One of the boarders.
And
he ends up here.
And he ends up bringing in here.
But these three gentlemen are not the only. You said there were 14 doctors that passed through this room throughout the night.
And all of them have really interesting names and stories along the way. So just to name a few, to highlight a few, one of the first doctors to arrive is this gentleman right here. His name is Dr. Charles Lieberman. He is a doctor that originally practiced in Tsarist Russia in the 1840s.
Wow.
Which is amazing.
Right.
He immigrates here to the United States, ends up having a practice here on F Street, which is just the street just up the next block.
Okay.
But he ends up also later in life founding the Georgetown Medical School.
Wow.
He hears the commotion, grabs his medical kit, comes here as well. He's the first doctor to arrive.
Okay.
Next up, you're going to have this gentleman. Some of you folks, if you may recognize this gentleman, Dr. R.K. Stone. This is Lincoln's family doctor, his personal doctor. He is the preeminent doctor in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Focusing on ophthalmic and oral surgery, right? Next up, you're going to have, I'm sure some of you folks may remember this gentleman too, or know his face, Dr. Barnes. This is Surgeon General of the United States, Surgeon General Barnes. He is going to arrive here when Edwin Stanton does as well. Barnes originally goes, we were talking before a little bit about William Seward getting stabbed, the Secretary of State, in his attack.
Right.
Barnes originally goes there, realizes that there's already a doctor there, Dr. Verity, and he says, well, okay, let me go into the other attack. But he brings along with him this gentleman, the Assistant Surgeon General, Dr. Crane. Dr. Crane would later preside over the Garfield assassination as well. So again, another assassination story there. This gentleman is Dr. Augusta Abbott. In Toronto, he ends up studying and studies medicine. He
Right.
wants to help
Like
out.
Alexander Augusta.
Like
did the same.
Alexander Augusta.
This
He actually
studies-
studies. He actually studies under Augusta.
in
Actually,
Canada?
In
Oh,
Canada,
oh, wow,
yeah.
okay.
But he would volunteer his services back in the United States during the American Civil War, and end up actually being part of what's called Camp Barker. Today, the U Street corridor in Washington D.C. This was a contraband of war camp, right? So this was a refugee camp for those self-emancipating peoples. But he ends up coming down here all the way from U Street. That's a hefty trek if you have come here to D.C. before. Realize that he's the last doctor to arrive, frees a crowd, realizes that he can't really help out anymore. Right. So what he does instead is he starts to write down what we will call today his Lincoln's charts, right? So he includes every single timestamp on the top right-hand side, or top left-hand side, excuse me, for you. You would see the 1245 mark. Lincoln's pulse there is going to be about 70, right? And what's interesting is that it goes up and down throughout the night. Now, you may see it drop on occasion. I actually think I may have this backwards. There we go. That might be a little bit better for you. Sorry about that.
Sure, that's okay.
But so it comes in from about 11 there, all the way straight through until 7:22 the following morning down to the bottom right-hand side. And you may see his pulse go up and down throughout the night.
Okay.
This corresponds with them removing that blood clot.
Okay,
right?
okay.
So they do that 7 times throughout the night.
So when they remove it, everything improves a little bit?
Slightly. But again, there's Lincoln losing more blood, right?
Yeah.
And this is the catch-22 situation, right? Do we keep the blood clot? Do they keep the blood clot in and risk Lincoln dying due to pressure buildup inside the cranial cavity, or do they remove that blood clot and alleviate some of that pressure and help him improve?
Wow, that's incredible. So I just think that's an incredible story. He contributes a lot, and here's this African-American surgeon, just sort of a distillation of the social change of the Civil War, really, here at the end of Lincoln's life. So Leal, he changes his story over time, okay, as medical science evolves. So tell us a little bit about that.
So Leal has 3 different types of accounts, and the way that we kind of break it down is by 1865, 1867, and 1909.
Okay.
Those are the 3 dates that we have the majority of his documentation from. The 1865 accounts are known as the most immediate, most important, diagram of what happened inside this back room. He has 2 letters that are today in the New York Public Library in the Sanitary Commission section, 2 that are in the National Archives in the Adjutant General section, and he has 1 letter, which I think is really interesting, and this is a copy of that letter. If you could read cursive, very good on you. It is sometimes very difficult to decipher, especially on camera. But this is a letter not for Leal's own records, but to a good friend by the name of Dwight Dudley, another doctor in New York City. But this letter is written a little bit later on, actually after the death of the conspirators. And so he, basically all the same, very methodical, very meticulous in the details and the medical terminology. But this letter in particular is interesting because he notes specifically about the execution of the conspirators, and calling them a rather inferior-looking group, which I think is kind of funny.
But he doesn't really change his story too much in
Not in the 65 letters.
In the 65, okay.
Yeah. In the 67 letters, again, nothing much changes. The 67 letter is interesting because it's done for the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. That record is in Benjamin Butler's collection. So Benjamin Butler's the one leading that impeachment trial. The most interesting record, however, is going to be this one right here. This is the 1909 account. Leal writes this for the 100th birthday of Abraham Lincoln. And here we have 3 discrepancies. 1, Leal says that he does not include the fact that he uses his small finger.
Because that's no good by that time.
That's no good
People
by that
are like,
time.
No, that's a bad. So he doesn't mention.
He doesn't mention the finger in Lincoln's brain. He also mentions. He says giving closed chest compressions. So this is where we get the idea that he gives CPR. Doesn't give CPR. That doesn't come around to the 1960s. But instead, it is Hall's ready resuscitation method.
Was it very different?
So from what Leal described, the Hall's ready resuscitation method includes 2 stages. One with Leal straddling Lincoln, using his fists to help rub underneath the ribcage, help stimulate airflow into the lungs, as well as having assistance on Lincoln's arms and extremities, pumping them to help get anaerobic exercise.
Similar,
So that's what he says in the 65 account. Here he just says closed chest compressions, and also says that he blew breath into Lincoln as well. So again, here's that mix-up with the CPR. The last discrepancy here, which I think is also interesting, is that he says that he has a turn with the Nelaton probe. I like to think that all these doctors are like lining up with the Nelaton probe.
So explain the Nelaton probe.
Yes. So a Nelaton probe is a medical instrument. It's a long metal rod with a piece of white porcelain on the end, that bulb. And what the idea of it is to stick it into the bullet wound, to kind of poke and prod around for the bullet, and once it hits that lead bullet of the 1860s caliber, it would leave a gray mark on that white porcelain. So that's where you would know where the bullet is. Leal says he has a turn on this. We don't believe that is the case, just because Dr. Barnes, the Surgeon General, has a turn. He doesn't. He can't find it. Dr. Stone, the preeminent doctor, he has a turn. He can't find it. So I would doubt that this 23-year-old
horrible, macabre, but somehow not comic, but dark comedy of like, give me a shot with that thing.
Right. Well, and that's the idea with these 14 doctors. They all come inside. Well, if he can't, I can.
Right.
But I think what's most touching about this account and all the accounts, well, this one in particular, is that when Lincoln passes at 7:22 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, Leal says that he's holding Lincoln's hand. And so, again, some may confuse this with taking a radial pulse, right? But in this account, he specifically mentions hand because he wanted to, quote, if Lincoln should somehow miraculously regain consciousness, he would most certainly be blind, be confused, and Leal said in this account he wanted to know that there was a friend by his bedside. So a very rich, sentimental view in that aspect.
Amazing.
I almost forgot. There's a picture of the Nelaton probe.
Yeah.
So this is in the Army Medical Museum today. So there's that Nelaton probe we were talking about.
And the porcelain's on this end.
Porcelain would have been on the tip of the bulb. So. And the last picture here for you, which I absolutely love. This is also in the Army Medical Museum in Silver Spring. This is the bullet. This is the ball that killed Abraham Lincoln.
And you said during the autopsy, that's when they discovered it.
Yeah, so there's, keep in mind, during an autopsy, the attending surgeons that attended to a patient, they're not the ones doing the actual autopsy. Instead, there's going to be a couple other doctors doing that autopsy.
Gotcha.
And so the Surgeon General Barnes, he's going to be there, but he's watching this autopsy of Lincoln, and he says that, quote, and there it was, a small black mass passing through my fingers, going around the dish, so small, can cause so much change in these states, the likes of which we may never or shall never see the ends of.
Man. Garrett Kost, thank you so much for that.
Of course, yeah.
This is Dana Shove and Garrett Kost signing off once again from the back bedroom of the Petersen house where Abraham Lincoln passed away.